Hello friends, welcome to Political Science and International Relations. In this lecture, we are going to study the two important approaches to study international relations. One is idealism and the other is realism. If you are a student of Political Science and International Relations, you would have already come across these two terms. There are many approaches to study international relations. Marxism as an approach, functionalism as an approach, liberalism as an approach, neo-functionalism as an approach, complex interdependence as an approach. But these two approaches are the principal approaches, predominant approaches we can say. Approach means the perspective to study international relations. We can also see idealism and realism as theories in international relations. Important world leaders, they can be classified as either idealists or realists. Woodrow Wilson, the former president of US, he was seen as an important idealist. India's own Mahatma Gandhi was also seen as an idealist. There are many realists, especially from the Western Hemisphere. Bismarck was seen as a realist. Former American presidents Truman, Ronald Reagan, Richard Nixon, they are seen as realists. India's own Indira Gandhi, she was seen as a realist. So we can classify the leaders themselves into idealists as well as realists. Okay friends, we will first discuss the approach idealism, then we will study the approach realism. Idealism is sometimes interchangeably used with the term liberalism. However, liberalism and idealism are not exactly the same. Idealism in international relations is linked to the values of European Enlightenment. The most important scholar is Immanuel Kant, German philosopher, Enlightenment scholar Immanuel Kant. Idealism is related to ideas and values. Immanuel Kant upheld peace. According to Kant, peace is the end of all hostilities and not the suspension of hostilities. So Immanuel Kant was seen as an idealist. He belonged to the Enlightenment period. He was an advocate of peace. So we can trace idealism approach in international relations as a part of the larger subject political science. Okay, we will now discuss the important tenets of idealism. Idealism is also referred to as utopianism. What is utopian? Utopian is a situation or a condition or a society which is seen as ideal, but it may not be possible. This is called utopian. For example, Karl Marx's vision of communism is seen by many as a utopian concept. It is desirable but very difficult to achieve. So idealism is also seen as utopianism. Utopianism definitely has values, ideas. The idea of man is actually manifested in the form of utopia. That's why we call it as utopianism. Now, idealism is an approach which is giving importance to morals and ideals in international relations rather than power and the pursuit of national interest. Realism is actually connected to power and national interest. We will study realism in detail next. Idealism is just the opposite of realism. According to idealism, power and national interest alone does not decide international relations. It does not guide international relations. It does not guide foreign policy. Rather, the moral values and ideals should guide foreign policy. For example, India's leader Mahatma Gandhi was an idealist. He had ideas and values. For example, non-violence is an idea attributed to Mahatma Gandhi. Now, India's foreign policy reflects Mahatma Gandhi's ideal, which is non-violence. Now, this is nothing but idealism. So, you are giving importance to the values and ideals when you try to engage with the rest of the world. Apart from this, the idealism approach and the idealist scholars, they are very much supportive of international peace. When realism goes for power, idealism wants to go for peace. Today, Israel, the state actor, and Hamas, non-state actor, are fighting with each other. You see realism in this concept. Hamas as well as the state of Israel are trying to ensure national interest. They use power. This is realism. But idealists are opposed to this. They are optimistic of international peace. If you ask an idealist about the Israel-Palestine conflict, the idealist will argue for peace. He will argue for a peaceful solution to the Israel-Palestine conflict because he wants international relations to be guided by values and ideals. Apart from this, the idealists also want to reform the international system, strengthen cooperation between countries, and strengthen international law. Got it? So, they want cooperation between states at the international level. State A, State B, State C, and so on. They want cooperation between the states. They don't want fighting between the states. They don't want conflict between the states. So they advocate cooperation and they want to strengthen the international law and the international system. According to them, international organizations can be created through which we can establish international law, strengthen international law, ensure cooperation between the countries, and reduce fighting and conflict between the countries. Idealists will support international organizations such as UN, IMF, and so on, because these institutions reduce the power conflict. Through these institutions, the countries go for cooperation rather than fighting with each other. In these international institutions, law is the guide which lays down the rules and regulations according to which the countries work with each other. They maintain peace in the world. Take the International Court of Justice within UN. The International Court of Justice within UN is an organization. It has law. The law ensures that the states having problems or conflicts between them can approach ICJ so that ICJ can resolve the conflicts, thereby leading to international peace. So this is the basis of idealism. Apart from this, when it comes to foreign policy, idealism is an important factor. What is foreign policy? The set of principles, statements, and objectives which act as a framework through which a country interacts with the rest of the world is called foreign policy. Foreign policy is also guided by idealism. Every country has a foreign policy. India also has a foreign policy. The foreign policy is nothing but a framework. The framework contains principles, ideas, values. It puts forward certain objectives. So this is a foreign policy. The foreign policy is a framework through which a country interacts with the rest of the world, conducts relations with the rest of the world, tries to achieve its national interest, and also works for the larger interest of the world. Now, idealism tells that the domestic values and ideas of a country should reflect in the foreign policy. This is a foreign policy. You have the principles, ideas, values. Idealist tells that the values, ideas, these should reflect at the international level. The ideas, values which are already present at the domestic level should reflect in the international level. Take the example of India. India's foreign policy itself is guided by historical and traditional principles and values like non-violence. Non-violence given by Buddhism. Buddha spoke about non-violence. Gandhi spoke about non-violence. These values are reflecting in the foreign policy of India. Nothing but idealism. In fact, realism also reflects in the Indian foreign policy. Both realism and idealism reflects in the foreign policy of all countries, which includes India. But now we are focusing on the idealistic approach. So foreign policy should reflect the domestic values. Take the example of China. China has some ideals, values. Communism is a domestic ideal. Communism automatically reflects in the foreign policy of China. Chinese nationalism is an important value which once again reflects in the foreign policy. For many Arab countries, Arab nationalism is a domestic value which reflects in the foreign policy. For example, the Arab countries have already established a cooperation between them in the form of an organization called Arab League. The Arab League is nothing but a reflection of the domestic cultural value. So we can give many examples. Democracy is a value. India is a democracy. Japan is a democracy. The domestic value and idea, democracy, has brought India and Japan together as allies over the years. The most important world leader associated with idealism was a former US President, Woodrow Wilson. You may be very surprised to know that US earlier stayed away from wars, conflicts. It stayed away from the affairs of foreign countries. This policy was called non-intervention. Right from the independence of US in the 18th century till the early 20th century, roughly after the end of the First World War, US's policy was non-interventionism. What is non-interventionism? Starting from the first president of US till Woodrow Wilson, non-intervention was the ideal. Non-intervention tells that a state will not involve itself in military alliances or wars. It will not involve itself in the politics of other states. For example, if the European states fight among each other, between each other, US does not have anything to do with this conflict. It simply stays away. This is called non-intervention. At the same time, US will work. It will commit itself for international cooperation for the constructive reasons. So non-intervention does not isolate any country, but it simply keeps the country away from external conflicts, wars and disputes. The country takes its national interest into account. It does not involve itself with different blocs. This is non-intervention. US was following non-intervention for a very long period. Woodrow Wilson strengthened non-intervention. In fact, during his rule, non-intervention was seen as isolationism. Isolationism is a step above non-intervention. Non-intervention says that the country won't involve itself in military alliances or wars. But isolationism tells that apart from non-involvement in wars or alliances, the country will stay isolated from the rest of the world. It won't even commit itself to work with other countries even for constructive purposes, like going for trade agreements, working for economic progress and so on. During the interwar period, World War I to World War II, American concept of non-intervention was seen by many as isolationism. Woodrow Wilson wanted to keep US away from the First World War. However, US was forced to become a member of the Allied Powers, also called Entente, in the First World War. UK, France, Russia, Italy, Japan were the important players who had imperial ambitions. US did not have imperial ambitions at that time. It had, but only to a minimal extent. It was not seen as an imperial power at that time. But US entered the First World War for certain issues that affected its national interest. For example, the Germans, they attacked the US trade ships. This directly affected US's national interest. As a result, US was forced to enter the First World War. Otherwise, US would not have even entered the First World War. Now anyway, US entered the First World War. First World War came to an end. Now Woodrow Wilson wanted to keep US away from the politics of Europe. US was located much far away in North America. Europe was far away. This physical distance between US and Europe, separated by the Atlantic Ocean, provided the geographical advantage for US. It was able to keep itself away from the European affairs and militarism. Woodrow Wilson came up with a list of values called the 14 points, which became very famous. The 14 points reflected idealism. The 14 points were nothing but a reflection of the domestic values of US. Under the 14 points, the important points were democracy, free trade, and self-determination. What do you understand here? 14 points of Woodrow Wilson were reflecting idealism. The domestic values of US, the non-interventionist state at the time, were actually manifesting themselves in the form of the foreign policy of US. This was the 14 points. 14 points were greatly welcomed by the people of US. It helped Woodrow Wilson in his elections. And Woodrow Wilson was very instrumental in the establishment of the League of Nations, even though US did not join the League of Nations. League of Nations established in 1920 after the end of the First World War. In 1919, a treaty called Versailles Treaty was signed, which brought peace between countries which fought during the First World War. So Versailles Treaty of 1919, League of Nations 1920. Former President of US Woodrow Wilson was very instrumental. So the American people appreciated Woodrow Wilson for keeping US away from the European politics, militarism and wars. Even today, Woodrow Wilson is seen as a towering personality when it comes to the idealist approach of international relations. There are other idealist leaders around the world. There are many. In the Indian context, it was Mahatma Gandhi himself. The first Prime Minister of India, Nehru himself, was seen as an idealist by many. He was guided by ideals like democracy, socialism. He was influenced by the political and economic system of USSR, with which he established a strong friendship after the 1950s, after the regime of Joseph Stalin. So Nehru himself was seen as an idealist. However, idealism was criticized slowly after the Second World War. What is the reason? The Treaty of Versailles failed. Germany emerged as a very strong military power and as an important imperial power after the end of the First World War. Germany declared war on other European states. It was joined by Japan and other powers, Axis powers. So the idealism could not prevent a Second World War. Apart from this, the League of Nations itself failed. Today's United Nations actually succeeded the League of Nations. But League of Nations was a failure. In UN, only 5 countries have the veto power in UNSC. But in League of Nations, all countries had veto power. It was an organization characterized by inefficiency and lack of consensus as well as power. That is why it was later replaced by UN. Now these developments led to the emergence of realism. Even though realism can be traced to an earlier period, realism in the modern context, 20th century, emerged around 1930s. Now a need was felt for US to play a larger role in world affairs. US can no longer shy away from the politics of the Atlantic. Slowly, US entered the Second World War. Both US and Europe were affected by the Great Depression of 1930s, after which US helped Europe. Slowly, European politics and US politics got interlinked. So, US later became an active player in the world politics. It itself became an imperial power later and took part in the Second World War. So this is how idealism later gave way to realism. Harry S. Truman, the later president of US, he was seen as a realist. He came up with a doctrine called Truman Doctrine. Truman Doctrine was a realist doctrine. It wanted to ensure US's interest in the world. Okay friends, we have now studied the concept of idealism. Idealism, even though overshadowed by realism, later re-emerged in the 1970s in the form of neoliberalism. Now neoliberalism is similar to idealism, but neoliberalism or neo-idealism, it is actually going by the earlier tenets of idealism. Neoliberalism emphasizes the scope for cooperation in the world. It is against war. It is against conflict. At the same time, neoliberalism does not deny the anarchy in the world. Neoliberalism accepts the anarchy. What is anarchy? A state of affairs where there is no centralized regulation. This is called anarchy. So neoliberals started accepting the nature of the world, which is characterized by anarchy. They also recognized the importance of the state. So this is how idealism later modified itself. Apart from this, the end of the Cold War and globalization gave more impetus to the liberal theory. Liberalism is actually used interchangeably with idealism. Liberalism in international relations is an approach. It was nothing but a tempered version of idealism after the Second World War. It is actually borrowing from idealism. Liberalism itself can be seen as a subset of idealism. Like idealism, liberalism is opposed to war and conflict, and it is specifically acknowledging the failures of idealism, and it is going for a set of international institutions based on rule of law and cooperation so that we can prevent conflicts in the world. So this is called liberalism. Okay friends, we will now study the concept of realism. Realism is the second approach which is used to study international relations. Realism approach tells that countries are guided by national interest and power. So these are the two important guidelines according to realism. It tells that when a country engages in international relations or formulates its foreign policy, it tries to wield its power. It goes for national interest. A country itself is a community of human beings. The country called state is a physical unit as well as a political unit, which has a territory which is physical. It has sovereignty. It has a home population. It has an institution called government. Now, this state actually reflects the instinct of a human being, is it not? Scholars who follow the organic theory, organic school, they consider the state as an organism. Naturally, the state will try to satisfy its interest first. So, realist school tells that any country will go for its national interest first, and it will always give importance to power. The realist approach, it is offering a realistic account of the world affairs. That is why it is called the realist approach, realistic. Okay, there is an associated term called realpolitik. Realpolitik is practical politics, real politics. The realist school is also called the school of power politics. Realism, also called the school of power politics. Now, this approach is based on two basic assumptions. The first assumption is that people are essentially selfish and competitive. Egoism is the guiding factor. The second is the states in the context of the world or the international system operate in international anarchy. Anarchy means there is absence of any centralized power, and in such a situation there is no authority higher than the sovereign state. So first assumption is egoism, and the second assumption is anarchy. What is egoism? The states are similar to human beings. Human beings are essentially selfish and competitive. They always go for their interest first. This is the first assumption. Second assumption is that the world itself is characterized by lack of centralized power. In such a situation, each country will definitely try to ensure its sovereignty. You imagine a village or a town with no law, with no police. Now this is nothing but anarchy. Now in such a situation, each and every human being will definitely try to maximize his interest, is it not? So this is the view of the realist scholars. So it is nothing but egoism plus anarchy. While the idealists advocate cooperation, the realists tell that the world is characterized by conflict and power politics. They see the world as an arena of conflict where you find operation of egoism and anarchy. The realists were actually practical here. Realism got strengthened around the 1930s. At that time, idealism was severely criticized. The failure of the Treaty of Versailles, the failure of the League of Nations, the 14 points put forward by Woodrow Wilson, they cannot prevent a second world war. So idealism was heavily criticized. Now realism was given importance. Now realists were able to prove that the world was egoistic, the countries were egoistic, and that the world itself was nothing but anarchy. Fascist Germany, fascist Italy wanted to fight against other countries despite presence of the League of Nations. The League of Nations was not respected. So what is the use of an organization? What is the use of international law? What is the use of an agreement to cooperate with each other? Now, all these were unable to operate in the real world context. So, realists they were giving a realistic account, a practical account of the world affairs during the interwar period. The important realist, the father of realism we can say, in the modern period was Machiavelli, Niccolo Machiavelli. Machiavelli himself is considered the modern father of political science. Father of political science, Aristotle. Modern father of political science, Machiavelli. Machiavelli gave importance to power. He gave importance to interest. He gave importance to the autonomy of the political. He envisaged the ruler in the form of a prince who should be ruthless. The prince should not be guided by ideals and morals. Rather, the prince should be guided by realism. He should be realistic. He should be ready to keep morals aside in order to protect the state and regulate the state. So Machiavelli himself was a realist. Then the Athenian historian Thucydides, he lived in the ancient period. He was also seen as a realist. Thomas Hobbes, who opened the gates for liberalism, is also seen as a realist. His classic work was a Leviathan, written in 1651. In the Indian context, you are able to see realism in the philosophy of Chanakya, was also called Kautilya. Chanakya was a realist. Chanakya was talking about international relations. So realism as a philosophy was seen in the ancient Indian philosophy. Sam, Dam, Dand, Bed. Philosophy given by Chanakya. How a king should successfully overcome his enemies and ensure his rule. Nothing but realism. Mandala theory related to foreign policy in Indian philosophy itself is a form of realism. Mandala theory tells that a state may have a neighbor who is the enemy. Ari means enemy. Neighbor of the state. Assume this is your state, then the immediate neighbor could be an enemy. Now how to tackle this enemy? How to overcome this enemy? The solution is given. The state should befriend the neighbor of the enemy. This is the neighbor of the enemy. Now this state should befriend the neighbor. Now the enemy of the enemy is seen as mitra or friend for the state. Now this goes on. Enemy, then mitra. A form of realism, a theory of realism in Indian philosophy. Scholars like Chanakya have put forward. In the modern context, there are many realist leaders across the world. Harry Truman of US, who came up with the Truman Doctrine. Indira Gandhi of India, Ronald Reagan of US, Richard Nixon of US, the present day presidents of the world, Vladimir Putin of Russia, the earlier president of US, Donald Trump. These leaders can be seen as realist leaders. North Korean President Kim Jong-un is also a realist. These leaders first take into account the interest of their own country. Donald Trump came with the slogan, America First. America First slogan reflects realism. Even though Donald Trump was seen as a political brinksman, he is nevertheless a realist. Okay friends, I hope you have understood the concept of realism now. Realists will not hesitate to go for war if needed. They will try to safeguard their national interest and sovereignty at any cost. As already said, the world itself is seen as an environment of anarchy where there is no centralized control. As a result, the countries of the world will definitely try to wield power to ensure their national interest. Within realism, the two schools are classical realism and structural realism. Structural realism is also called neo-realism. This in turn can be divided into defensive realism and offensive realism. The important scholar in classical realism was Morgenthau. One of the important scholars in structural or neo-realism was Walsh. Okay, we will now look into the classical school first. Classical realism is going by the basic assumption of realism, but it is giving importance to the egoism more. We studied two aspects in realism, is it not? First was egoism. Classical realism gives importance to egoism. Structural realism gives importance to anarchy. Right? There is a difference between the two schools of thought within realism. Morgenthau, Hans Morgenthau, he was seen as the father of political realism in the modern period. Morgenthau told that man is a power-seeking animal. His book was Politics Among Nations. How did Morgenthau call human? Man is a power-seeking animal. No wonder he is seen as a realist. He is giving importance to power. He sees man as somebody who always goes after power. His book is Politics Among Nations. Hans Morgenthau was a German-Austrian political scientist. Kenneth Walsh was an American political scientist. Within structural realism or neo-realism, there are two schools of thought. One is offensive realism and the other is defensive realism. Offensive and defensive. Both forms of realism are seen as forms of structural realism. First is offensive realism. We will see what offensive realism is. It is a form of structural realism which sees states as power maximizers. So they tell that the states are power maximizers. India is a power maximizer. Pakistan is a power maximizer. America is a power maximizer. Even a small state, Nepal or Bhutan, is seen as a power maximizer according to offensive school. According to this school, a bipolar world is more stable than a multipolar world. What is a bipolar world? A bipolar world is a world where there are two superpowers. That is, two very strong states. This bipolar world is seen to contribute to stability because one superpower checks the other. A bloc formed under one superpower naturally will be checked and watched by the other bloc under another superpower. The important scholar under offensive realism is Mearsheimer. Please ensure to take notes. I hope you have taken notes on what we have discussed so far. So states are not satisfied with a given amount of power. They continue to seek power. The other school is defensive realism. The important scholars are Kenneth Walsh and Mastandino. Defensive realism sees states as security maximizers. The defensive realism tells that there is anarchy in the world. It accepts anarchy, as already seen, but the states are rational. They just don't go to fight with each other. They don't desire war. They don't want to destroy each other, but rather they are power seekers, but they are also security maximizers. This is how the defensive realists see the state of affairs in the world. Defensive realism tells that the anarchy prevalent in the world encourages the states to maintain moderate and reserved policies to attain national security. You can look at the nuclear doctrine of states such as India and China. India and China are incorporating a no first use policy within their nuclear doctrine. Now we can see China and India as security maximizers. Why do you have a nuclear doctrine? We know that there is anarchy in the world. Despite presence of organizations like UN, there is a degree of anarchy. State sovereignty is seen as predominant and important by all countries of the world. So national security should be ensured at any cost. That is why we have a no first use policy within the nuclear doctrine. But how is the nuclear doctrine seen? It is seen in the form of security maximization rather than power maximization. The no first use policy is telling that India and China will not use their nuclear weapons in the first instance. India and China will use the nuclear weapons only if the enemy country uses the nuclear weapons first. So these countries are security maximizers. They are not power maximizers. We can give many such examples. Countries often go for military alliances through which they maximize their security, even though there is anarchy in the world. You see military alliances in the Atlantic. You see military alliances in the Indo-Pacific. Recently, a military alliance was established between US, UK and Australia called AUKUS in the Indo-Pacific. Anarchy is prevalent in the Indo-Pacific. At the same time, the states try to maximize their security rather than maximize the power. This is the concept of defensive realism. If you look at India's foreign policy, it is a mix of idealism as well as realism. Many students of political science simply gauge India's foreign policy as idealistic. Many even consider India's foreign policy as a failure. This is not correct. This is not the correct analysis of our foreign policy. India's foreign policy is a time-tested policy, matured policy. It has seen many successes. At the same time, it has seen some failures as well. This is the reality. This is how we see India's foreign policy. India's foreign policy is a mix of idealism and realism. Where do we see idealism? What is idealism? Domestic values reflecting in the foreign policy. Idealism, values like non-violence, peace, Vasudhaiva Kudumbakam, these are reflected in the form of idealism. Realism is also seen through the foreign policy of India. India is not a cowardly state. We respect each other's territorial sovereignty and integrity. Respecting territorial sovereignty and integrity, we tell other states that we won't compromise on our national security no matter what. These words may seem rather standard or normal on paper, but they carry great weightage. Nothing but realism, is it not? Territorial sovereignty and integrity. We have the second largest army in the world. We have nuclear weapons. Nothing but realism. At the same time, we go by these values. Realism is also seen in the form of India's thrust on non-interference. Don't mess with me. I won't mess with you. What is this? Realism. The nuclear doctrine of India itself is a mixture of realism and idealism. The Indian prime ministers who ruled India right from independence till now, from Mr. Nehru to Mr. Modi, you can see a mixture of both idealism and realism. Nobody is completely idealist, nobody is completely realist. But the degree may vary. Nehru, higher degree of idealism, relatively lower degree of realism. Indira Gandhi, the current Prime Minister Modi, you see a higher degree of realism and a relatively lower degree of idealism. So this is the mixture of idealism and realism that you see in the ideologies and the vision of leaders across the world. In order to prevent international conflict or resolve ongoing conflict, one needs to go by both idealistic approach as well as realistic approach. You cannot go only as a realist. Realism alone will increase the conflict. It will lead to more wars. It will perpetuate the violence. Idealism alone also is not enough. It dilutes national sovereignty. So we have to go for a mixture of idealism and realism. If you look at the history, history itself proves this fact. Many conflicts have been resolved through idealism as well as realism. Thank you.